chapter 9 is assume that the person you are listening to might know something you don't. This is a chapter about conversation and about the different forms conversation takes. And it's a chapter about humility. And it's a chapter about listening. And the humility element is, it took me a long time to understand why there's religious injunctions supporting humility. And so what that means is that every time you encounter some evidence that you're ignorant, someone points it out, you should be happy about that because you think, oh, you just told me how I'm wrong. It's like, great. Like maybe I had to sift through a lot of nonsense to get through the real message that you're telling me, but if you could actually tell me some way that I'm wrong, and then maybe give me a hint about how to not be wrong like that, well then I wouldn't have to be wrong like that anymore. That would be a good thing. And many of those things are little tools that you can put in your toolkit, like Batman, and then you can go out into the world and use those tools, and you don't have to fall blindly into a pit quite as often. And so the humility element is, well, do you want to be right? Or do you want to be learning? And it's deeper than that. It's, do you want to be the tyrannical king who's already got everything figured out? Or do you want to be the continually transforming hero, or fool for that matter, who's getting better all the time? And that's actually a choice, you know. It's a deep choice. And it's better to be the self-transforming fool who's humble enough to make friends with what he or she doesn't know and to listen when people talk.
Well, Jordan Peterson ends this session with a brilliant phrase, make friends with what you don't know. It requires thinking about that. And a fascinating concept of the ever-transforming fool. The Jewish people have a different name for that. In Ethics of Our Fathers, which I've mentioned back in Rule 1, Pirkei Avot, Chapter 4 opens with a statement by Rabbi Ben Zoma, who says, what's the definition of a wise man? Is someone who learns from every man, from everybody else. Means he listens. There's something to learn from everybody. So I'm not sure why Dr. Peterson insists on labeling it the ever-transforming fool. He might have been better off using the Jewish practice of calling it that as a wise man. Listen. Now, in terms of listening, that's how he started this session. He said this is a discussion about humility and listening. And it's interesting. The humility that he's talking about is not the humility that he spoke about back in Rule 2, where he described how we feel so fragile about ourselves. We know we're fragile, and we know we're imperfect, and we know that we can do bad things. And do bad things. And so we feel negatively about ourselves. That humility drags you down. The humility that he's talking about is one that propels you forward. Is that recognizing that you don't know everything, but you can learn more. Listen, and you'll learn things that you didn't know before. You'll make friends with what you don't know. Be familiar with it. But he doesn't give us any practical advice on how to do that. And it's a problem. Jewish people have a practice, and I'll describe the practice through a joke. Somebody asked a Jewish person once, why do you guys always ask so many questions? And the guy responded, why not? He responded with a question. Because we have ingrained a habit, the Jewish people, of asking questions. And I think the reason for it is because by asking questions, you pursue knowledge. And the advice is, don't be shy to ask questions. Don't be afraid of revealing that there's something you don't know. There's no reason to feel embarrassed about it. That feeling of embarrassment is something that just put it out of your mind. Ask the question, learn something new. And that will propel you forward. It's an act of humility, but you'll really be becoming a wise man by recognizing that you can learn something from every person you speak to. There's another Jewish practice that will help in this sense of learning the proper form of humility and learning from other people. And you might think it's universal, and it is. God wanted us to learn from each other and to be humble enough to recognize that we don't know it. So you're organized that we'll get into a situation that requires that, and that's called marriage. Men and women think differently. That's obvious to many people, but now scientists have discovered or proven that actually the brains are wired differently and they look at the world differently. There's different needs. Men and women have different needs and different drives, and that contributes to it. But on top of that, their brains are wired differently, and that winds up giving a different view of the world. And so getting married is you have to work it out with the person of the opposite sex, come to some kind of compromise or agreement on how to approach things. Now, everybody gets married, it's a universal practice, but I fear that too many times people are doing so out of the Rule 2 type humility. In other words, they're recognizing they're fragile, they can't do it their own, they need something. Men need, mostly, it's a generalization, but generally it's true, men get married for sexual intimacy, women get married more for security, and those are different needs. And they recognize they can't do it on their own, so that's the fragility and I can't do it, and then I have to have somebody support me. It's the negative aspect of the humility. But there's another approach to it. The Jewish people consider it a mitzvah, a Torah instruction to get married. In other words, we're recognizing that God wanted us to get married. In fact, why did God want us to get married? It's back in Genesis 2:24, after Adam realizes that it's the flesh of my flesh and the bone of my bones. God says, therefore, a man should leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they become one flesh. Now, it doesn't mean when you leave your father and mother, you should abandon them. And it also can't mean that become private. You don't have to tell me to be private with my wife. What it means is that every family develops their own approach, their kit of likes and dislikes, and the children grow up in that. They contribute to it, and they grow up in it. But then, when you become adult and you're going out and getting a spouse, then you're instructed, leave that style that you become used to and cleave to your spouse. Develop a new style. And that's what's going to happen, because you have to adjust to each other. And that's a learning process. And that's a humbling experience. And you learn to listen. And if you do it with the attitude that it's not that I can't supply myself with what I need, but that I'm following God's instruction. There's something positive to be gained here. I'm going to learn. I'm going to produce. Well, you're going to produce a family. That's also a big instruction. But aside from that, aside from the kids, there's also just the idea of becoming one flesh, of setting up a new household, a new way of looking at the world. That's also an accomplishment. And when you look at it this way, as a positive step of adjusting, that's difficult. It's difficult many times. There's arguments. But that's a positive accomplishment to seek that compromise, to seek that adjustment, to seek that reconciliation. You'll become not only the ever-transforming fool, you become a very wise person.